Well, good morning, everybody. My name is JP Fedigan. I've been a consultant with Berg Compliance Solutions since the fall of 2015. I manage both general industry and construction accounts for Berg Compliance Solutions. And today I will be giving a presentation on emergency action plans and basic fire prevention. So just to give you an idea of some of the things we're going to be covering. In short, when it comes to your emergency action plan, which is commonly known as an EAP, this is essentially the program at your facility to address any and all foreseeable hazards or foreseeable emergencies that you can expect at your facility and each facility's location. So if your company has multiple locations or multiple establishments, of course, general company policy will encompass each plan, but each location will need to have some site specificity with regards to what sort of emergencies you're preparing for and any sort of internal procedures you're going to have. And it looks like we already have, I'm not sure if we already have a question.
Looks like that's for Joanne, so we can save that for the end.
10-4. Well, moving forward, it's not uncommon for us to cover both of these topics at the same time, and it's not just because the standards are right next to each other in the CFR, but when it comes to your emergency action plan and your fire prevention plan, there are elements of each plan that are going to blend into the other. So when it comes to developing an EAP, when it comes to your foreseeable emergencies, fire-related emergencies are almost always going to be at the top of the list. And with regards to fire prevention and fire safety, when you are going through the decision-making criteria of when it is safe and opportune to use a fire extinguisher, the location of your emergency exits is going to be a variable in that equation as well. If you don't have an emergency exit to your back, you're not in a safe position to use an extinguisher. Now, when it comes to the requirements of your program, first and foremost, we are trying to minimize the danger to employees. So whatever sort of foreseeable emergencies you want to have procedures in place for pre-emergency planning, planning out your designated emergency exits, your routes of access and egress, ensuring that there are no exit routes going through high hazard areas and any routes are remaining unobstructed, but also ensuring that you have all the right and necessary emergency equipment in place and each type of equipment is being inspected on a regular basis. That frequency of inspection is definitely going to vary depending on the type of emergency equipment in question. But when it comes to your emergency action plan, you are trying to prepare for anything that you could expect. And so your plan needs to be as all-encompassing as possible. So you want to have procedures in place for how to plan for an emergency, the various personnel roles you're going to have, who's going to be conducting head counts, who's going to be guiding your employees to designated assembly areas, who will be sweeping work areas to ensure that no one's left behind. These personnel roles are very vital to your EAP. How you report an emergency, procedures for evacuating a building, any sort of established procedures and policies for fire prevention, and then of course, whatever sort of plan you have in place that you are training that plan to your employees. So when it comes to foreseeable emergencies, some common examples, of course, are fires and explosions, the releases of any sort of waste or hazardous substances, of course, medical related emergencies, any sort of emergency pertaining to severe weather. The recommendation I usually give to clients is if you have a facility within 100 miles of, say, a coastline, chances are your emergency action plan should include some sort of preparedness for hurricane-related emergencies. If your facility is a little further inland, then you should likely have some sort of plan in place for emergencies involving tornadoes. So if you're more like 150 miles or more from a coastline, you should likely have a tornado plan. And if you're in that 100 to 150 mile range, your EAP should likely have both. Another type of emergency that emergency action plans are starting to include a little bit more detail on is workplace violence. And whether you're talking about disgruntled employees, drunken or belligerent customers, potentially telephone bomb threats, things of that sort, you want to have some sort of procedure in place to address those types of emergencies. But first and foremost, you want to make sure that you have an emergency response coordinator selected. And if your company has more than one shift, or they require more than one emergency response coordinator for one reason or another, you want to make sure to include any and all applicable information. So their names, their job titles, what departments they're assigned to, if there's more than one shift, all of that information needs to be included. So when it comes to pre-emergency planning, you want to ensure that whatever plan you have in place is as familiar to your employees as possible. So you want to make sure that everyone doesn't just understand the plan, but any updates are made and on a timely basis, and they're posted in common areas. You want to ensure that everyone's familiar with not just the location of designated emergency exits, but the closest or the quickest path of egress in the case of an emergency. And usually it's recommended to have a backup. So if you always want to know the closest emergency exit, but if that path of egress is obstructed for whatever reason, you also want to have a backup emergency exit in the case of, say, a fire or a chemical spill. In addition to your exits, you want to make sure you are as familiar as possible with the location of various emergency equipment. So usually at the top of the list is fire extinguishers, emergency eye wash stations and safety showers. First aid kits is another one that's very important. And whatever kind of emergency equipment you have at your facility, you want to have those locations outlined and marked on your evacuation maps. One of the reasons we generally blend our emergency action plan training with our fire prevention training is because when it comes to assessing the foreseeable emergencies, inventorying your hazardous substances on site and any sort of workplace or major workplace fire hazard is probably going to be one of the first steps you take to listing out your foreseeable emergencies. So making a list of the different compressed gases you may have at your facility, any sort of oily waste, flammable chemicals, any sort of fuel stored on site, and in any type of general refuse as well that could catch fire. These are all types of things that you want to at least make note of so that you can plan around emergencies pertaining to those types of materials. But whenever it comes to planning your emergencies, you need to have key personnel selected. And the first, at the top of that list should be your emergency response coordinator. And this is essentially the employee who will be in charge of any incident that takes place at your facility until any emergency services arrive. So until any emergency services arrive on site, they are the incident commander. And even after emergency services arrive, they're going to continue to serve as a liaison between emergency responders and the personnel at your company. And really, when it comes down to it, they are the ones who need to be informed first of any sort of emergency, whether it's a fire-related emergency, a chemical spill, whatever the case might be. Even if an employee determines the need to call 911 first, the emergency response coordinator needs to be the first person at the company outside of that call who needs to be informed of the incident. Next in line, you have your evacuation coordinators. They're commonly known as sweepers. More often than not, this is going to be a supervisor or a foreman for a particular work area who's in charge of guiding employees towards the designated assembly area in the case of an emergency. More importantly, they are generally going to be the last person out of that work area, as they're going to sweep that area prior to their own evacuation to ensure that nobody else is left behind. Once employees have made their way to a designated assembly point, your evacuation coordinators are going to be initiating head counts for those groups, and whether everyone is accounted for or there's an employee who ends up missing, whatever the case might be, the result of that head count is going to be conveyed to the ERC. Now, if you have a large number of employees in a certain area, or there's a large area to cover in the case of a sweep, you may also have some support personnel designated to assist, generally with guiding employees to the assembly area so that an evacuation coordinator can sweep that area. And they may also assist with head counts once those employees make it to the designated assembly area or muster point. Some other roles that you may have in your emergency action plan may include either an emergency response team or some first aid providers. And regardless, if you have one of these two roles in your facility, anyone associated with these roles must have certain types of required training. So, for example, if you have an emergency response team or a team who is assigned to engage in any sort of emergency response, and they're trained in handling releases of hazardous substances, anybody on that team is required to have HAZWOPER training at the very least. If you have anyone who's acting as a team leader or an emergency response team coordinator, they may require some additional training. There is HAZWOPER 24, HAZWOPER 40, depending on the type of releases. Someone in a supervisory role may also require a HAZWOPER 8 supervisor course. But generally, if you don't have spill response as a common occurrence at your facility, it's usually going to be recommended to establish some sort of service agreement with a spill response contractor. For first aid providers, any employee who is expected or intended to provide first aid to any employee must have training in that type of service as well. First aid and CPR training, and sometimes AD is included, but those trainings are generally good for a period of 2 years. And that's true whether you are getting the user level training or you're getting first aid instructor level training. In either case, that course is generally good for 2 years. And I believe I did see a question. Okay, is there a certain number requirement as far as employees go to have a live fire drill with our current situation? There we go. Okay. Okay, it sounds like, okay, is there a certain number requirement as far as employees go to have a live fire drill in a facility with our current situation regarding COVID and trying to social distance as much as possible? Would a PowerPoint presentation go over where to go and what to do in the event of a fire? Okay. Well, when it comes to a live drill, emergencies could take place whether we are dealing with a COVID pandemic or not. So the actions that you will take during a fire drill during these times are not going to be very different from times outside of a pandemic. Now, when it comes to employee training, just like with today's presentation, normally we've done ARMA presentations in a live setting, but conveying employee training via Zoom meeting or through training modules, that is perfectly acceptable. All right. Okay, well, now when it comes to reporting an emergency, once you've recognized that an emergency is taking place, all employees do have the authority to dial 911 if they feel the emergency warrants that action. If there is any sort of confusion, or if the decision is if the person is kind of on the fence, then the knee-jerk reaction should be to contact the emergency response coordinator so that they can assess the situation and determine whether or not it would be appropriate to dial 911 for that particular case. But more importantly, whether the employee dials 911 or they contact the emergency response coordinator first, in either situation, the ERC will determine whether or not an evacuation would be necessary for that particular case. When it comes to your alarms, you need to have a standardized way of alerting your employees and your personnel in the case of an emergency, especially if an evacuation is deemed necessary. Now, how you go about it can vary. Some facilities have alarms such as the one you see on this slide that are sort of hardwired into the system. And in this case, you have pull alarms for both fire and for chemical spill related emergencies. You can use a telephoned intercom system to convey alerts to all employees at the same time. And if you, depending on the size of your facility, it's not unheard of to use items such as air horns or bull horns in order to convey an emergency to personnel. But whatever sort of alarming or alerting system you have in place, you just need to make sure that it is as emergency specific as possible, and it is also standardized throughout the company in order to eliminate any sort of potential confusion. Okay, looks like we've got one more question popping up. Okay, the question that I just received, how would you do an active shooter notification if you only have pull fire alarms? We have some cell phone use, but not all. Okay. Well, we're going to be talking a little bit about workplace emergencies in the next dozen slides or so. If it's all right, I'm going to hold off on this question until then. But thank you for that question. That is definitely a good one. So in the event of an emergency that warrants an evacuation, all personnel need to evacuate the work area using the nearest exit door. And that's why we recommend that it's important for employees to be familiar with not just the closest designated exit, but also a backup in case the route to that exit door becomes obstructed for whatever reason. Of course, walk, don't run. As I believe as Wyatt Earp used to say, take your time, but do it quickly. Once you make your way to the designated assembly area, you need to remain there until instructed to return either to the building or instructed to remain in place. But you definitely want to remain at the assembly area or the muster point at least through the head counts. But you definitely just want to keep in mind you don't want to wander off. In the case of an evacuation, everyone needs to be accounted for at all times. As I mentioned previously, you're going to have evacuation coordinators who are going to be conducting head counts for the employees in each of their respective work areas. And if anybody is identified as missing, the ERC needs to be notified immediately, and any sort of emergency services who are on site at that time must also be notified of this. Emergency services will be the ones responsible for conducting any sort of personnel rescue. You definitely don't want anybody internally performing any sort of emergency rescue or emergency medical related activities, especially if they have not received specific training in those actions. So it's important to note that employees are not expected to perform rescue or medical duties, and they are definitely not expected to use portable fire extinguishers prior to evacuating the building. So when it comes to your evacuation points, you want to just ensure that each path of egress is clearly marked on your evacuation maps. particularly so you can see how, the potential paths that you can take depending on where you're located in the building, and to also give you an idea of any sort of backup egress that you'll need to figure out in case the path you have in mind becomes obstructed for whatever reason. But when it comes to your evacuation drills, as I mentioned with alarms, your alarms, there needs to be significant effort to ensure that the alarms are emergency specific, and the same thing needs to be applied when you're conducting your emergency action plan drill. So you want to have emergency drills, not just for fires, but practice drills in the case of a chemical spill, in the case of a workplace emergency. So you just want to ensure that each type of foreseeable emergency is being drilled with your employees to ensure familiarity. So when it comes to foreseeable emergencies, we're going to start off with chemical spills. Of course, whether you have an established emergency response team or you've established an agreement with a spill response contractor, in either case, anytime an employee observes a chemical spill in the workplace, they need to notify a supervisor immediately or the ERC if they can have direct contact with them. But the emergency response coordinator will determine if and how, or sorry, not if, but how to clear the area, how to clean up the spill, and whether that is going to be handled internally or that's going to be handled through a third party, such as a spill response contractor. But in short, when it comes to handling a chemical spill emergency, the first step should always be to refer to the safety data sheet. The safety data sheet is going to include manufacturer related information pertaining to recommended personal protective equipment to use, recommendations for accidental release, first aid measures, anything and everything that would be pertaining to safely handling that chemical. With that information, the staff who are addressing the spill have the information needed to contain and neutralize the spill. At that point, they will then begin to cover the chemical with a type of absorbent, collect the material into a designated container. Once the cleanup has occurred, then they'll circle back around and try to decontaminate the surface. And finally, they'll dispose of the waste per the applicable regulation. When it comes to trying to mitigate any sort of potential fires or spills, a few points to remember. If you have any sort of flammable liquids in volumes of 1 quart or greater, they need to be stored in approved cabinets that are located throughout your facility. These are commonly known as flame lockers. Generally, they're going to be yellow in color. If you have a significant amount of corrosive chemicals on site, you'll definitely want to store those in a separate cabinet that is designed only for those types of chemicals. When it comes to the container for flammable liquids, you want to ensure that those are in very good condition, properly labeled as well. In addition to corrosives, you want to make sure that you're not storing any sort of combustible materials in flammable cabinets. And as I mentioned earlier, trash and general refuse is what they call a Class A fire hazard. And so if you have a high accumulation of trash in the workplace, you want to make sure that that's being removed in a timely manner as well. Looks like we just got another question. Would I be able to send this part of the webinar to you? Yes, I can do that after the presentation is over. Absolutely. Right. Next, we have medical emergencies. Anytime you have a medical related emergency, the first step should always be to dial 911. Whether you have received first aid training, if you previously worked as an EMT, it matters not. If you have a medical emergency, the first step to take is dialing 911. And whenever you make that call, you need to try to include as much applicable information as possible, starting off with the nature of the medical emergency, the location of the emergency. So not just the address to the facility, but also the building number, room number, anything like that. And then of course you want to provide the emergency responders with your name and phone number, just in case they need to call back for any additional information. Of course, in the case of a medical emergency, you want to refrain from moving the victim unless it is absolutely necessary. If you do have active training in CPR and first aid and you are able to provide that assistance, it's always going to be beneficial to do so however you can, especially until medical services arrive. But if you have no training whatsoever in first aid, really the only thing you can do is shout for help, and hopefully someone who has received that kind of information can make their way over, or they can contact somebody who does have that type of training. But some of the assistance you can provide if you are dealing with an injury that is resulting in bleeding, you can provide firm pressure on the wound in order to try and stop the bleeding or slow it down. In matters pertaining to choking, you can do what are called abdominal thrusts. We are trying to, I know the American Red Cross and other agencies are trying to push away from the H word when it comes to abdominal thrusts because there are some royalty issues involved. But whenever you're dealing with choking, if you can find a way to provide that right assistance, then of course do that. When it comes to medical emergencies, though, one of the most potentially hazardous kind are any sort of medical emergencies that are pertaining to potential exposure to hazardous materials. And if you are trying to provide any assistance to injured employees in cases such as this, you first and foremost want to go back to the safety data sheet. First aid measures that are recommended by the manufacturer are included in safety data sheets, in addition to any sort of recommended PPE. But again, in this case, you only want to attempt first aid in matters such as these if you have received proper training. Next, we're going to be talking about severe weather. In the cases of, say, a tornado or a hurricane, in matters pertaining to severe weather, part of your emergency action plan should include any sort of emergency sheltered areas. These are going to be areas that have no hazardous materials stored in place. You want to ensure that those areas don't have any windows or potential glass that could be broken. But usually these are going to be restrooms that are closer towards the center of the building. So you have multiple walls protecting you from the outside. So in the case of an emergency, say, such as a tornado, you want to proceed to these designated areas in a quickly and orderly fashion. You want to stay put until ordered to do so, of course. And this is probably one of the few instances where it might be a little on the acceptable side to run, but even then, try to refrain from running, especially in the cases of an emergency. I know with tornadoes, the alert time is generally going to be significantly less than that of a hurricane. With hurricanes, you generally have a day or two to prepare. With tornadoes, it's more like an hour or two. But just like with any other kind of emergency, your supervisors and or the ERC will take a head count. They'll contact 911 if there's a need for any emergency assistance. And if there is not much of an opportunity to perform proper sweeps, then everyone is generally going to be instructed to remain in place until it is safe to exit that designated area. And I believe we just got another question. Okay, so just received a question. If a person has the required training to help and assist with an emergency, are they required to assist, being that they have the proper training? Okay. Well, that one can get a little on the tricky side. I think it definitely would depend on the circumstances. I know in the case of first aid and CPR training, I can recall there being some mention of if you have the ability to provide assistance and you have recognized the emergency, you should at least offer. But again, in situations such as the case of a medical emergency that may involve contact with a hazardous chemical, there wouldn't necessarily be a requirement to provide assistance just because you've had training. So I think in short, the answer would be no. There's probably more reasons to say no than yes to that question. We can discuss that a little bit more later on in the presentation if that didn't properly answer your question. Going back to severe weather emergencies, the emergency response coordinator will be the one generally required to call 911 in the case of a tornado-related emergency, and only when it is safe to move out, about and around will the ERC proceed with a head count of any employees that are present on site. But in the case of any fire-related emergencies or missing personnel, ERC will respond to those incidents as they occur, and of course, any injured employees will be cared for by emergency services. As many of us know, in the case of severe weather, there is always the possibility of extended power loss. And dealing with blackouts in the workplace are very similar to dealing with blackouts in the at home. So starting off, you want to ensure that any sort of unnecessary electrical equipment and appliances are turned off, unplugged, so that once power is restored, you've reduced the chances of any sort of power surging taking place that could cause damage to equipment, especially sensitive electronics. Any sort of equipment that may contain fluids, especially fluids that may freeze during a long-term exposure to, say, freezing temperatures, need to be moved to a heated area, drained of any liquids, and provided with some sort of auxiliary heat source. And then, of course, once you have restoration of power and light, or excuse me, power and heat, then you want to ensure that any electronic equipment is brought back up to ambient temperatures before energizing to prevent any sort of condensate from forming on circuitry. And then, of course, any sort of fire and potable water piping should be checked for leaks and freeze damage after the heat has been restored to the facility and the water turned back on. So when it comes to foreseeable emergencies, finally, we have workplace violence emergencies. And workplace violence is essentially violence or the threat of violence against workers in an occupational environment. So these can occur either outside the workplace or at the workplace and can range anywhere from threats and verbal abuse to physical assaults and even homicide, which is a leading cause of job-related deaths. So when it comes to workplace violence, the examples that we generally give, this is, of course, a including but not limited to type of list, but drunken or belligerent customers or visitors that find their way onto your facility site, disgruntled employees, maybe ones who had quit and then came back a couple weeks later to give everyone their 2 cents. Sometimes you have incidents regarding armed robberies. I've had at least one client tell us stories of incidents involving telephone bomb threats. And last but not least, of course, we are, as time has gone on, we're seeing more incidents involving active shooters. And when incidents like that are taking place in the workplace, we definitely want to include some sort of procedures for how to react. And generally, the accepted procedure that is being trained across the board is the run, hide, fight principle. So, and specifically when we're talking about this, we're saying run, hide, fight in that order. So if you are dealing with matters pertaining to workplace violence, the first step should be to evacuate. If there is an accessible escape path, you want to try to take that in as timely a manner as possible. Once you have a chance to evacuate, or if an evacuation is not possible, at that point, you will try to shelter in place, find a place to hide where an active shooter or a similar aggravated individual is less likely to find you. Ideally, if you are going to shelter in place, or if you've run, if you found a way to evacuate the building and find a place to shelter outside, you want to ideally find a place where you can barricade yourself inside. If you can lock the door behind you, if you can place furniture or other heavy materials at the door to prevent access, these are going to be things to keep in mind in the case of hiding or sheltering in place. Last but finally, everybody has the right to protect themselves. And as a last resort, and only when you feel that your life is in imminent danger, should you ever attempt to disrupt or incapacitate an active shooter or other aggravated individual. This is always a very scary point to discuss, but these are things that can happen. And in the event of workplace violence, if it comes down to it, as I said, everybody has the right to defend themselves. And if you find yourself in that type of situation, do whatever means necessary to make your way safely out. Now that we've had a chance to go through a lot of the major aspects and items to consider when developing an emergency action plan at your facility, now we're going to take some time to talk about fire safety, fire extinguisher use, and some basic guidelines and criteria for when to safely and opportunely use a fire extinguisher in the case of a fire-related emergency. So when it comes to general fire prevention, all employees are responsible for controlling the ignition sources and maintaining the accumulation of flammables and combustible waste materials in their work areas. So any sort of major workplace fire hazard that you have, there needs to be steps taken and established steps, I should say, to controlling the accumulation of those materials and disposing of them in a timely manner, but also safely storing them and safely handling them so long as they're on site. So this is one of the reasons why when you're developing an emergency action plan, it is vital to list all the different potential fire hazards that you have on site. So if you have various chemicals such as acetone, any sort of chemical soaked rags, kerosene, various types of fuel, gasoline, diesel, two-stroke fuel. If you have compressed gas cylinders on site, oxygen and acetylene, these are definitely both fire hazards to inventory, but also combustible hazards, because compressed gas cylinders can be an explosion hazard under the right conditions. But finally, any sort of an electrical equipment or in electrical outlets that are near any sort of standing water or source of water, these will definitely want to be added to the list as well. When it comes to addressing fire, it's always common to try to convey details pertaining to fire fundamentals to your employees so that they can understand what it is that triggers a fire. And so anytime you have a fire, you have a heat source or an ignition source, a fuel source or combustible material that's going to feed the fire. And then of course you have oxygen to sustain combustion. And once these three sides of the triangle are together, they produce a chemical reaction that is fire. So when it comes to extinguishing a fire, you are essentially controlling or eliminating one or more side of this triangle. And because of this, it's important to understand the different types of fires that you could potentially face at your facility so that you can then select the proper extinguisher for those classes of fire. So a Class A fire, these are all your ordinary combustibles. This is going to be paper, trash, general refuse. A way to think about this is Class A for all sorts. Class B fires are going to be for flammable or combustible liquids. You can think Class B for boiling. Class C is for any sort of electrical fire, and we usually like to say Class C for circuitry. And then your Class D fires are going to be for any sort of flammable or combustible metals. And regardless of the type of fire, there are extinguishers out there to address one or more classification of fire. And so more often than not, you're going to see Class ABC. These are extinguishers that are filled with a dry chemical, but they're designed to extinguish Class A fires, Class B, and Class C. If you have combustible metals on your work site, generally you will require a Class D extinguisher, and these are commonly identified by their yellow color. But the different types of extinguishers are not just going to vary based on the class of fire, but also the type of extinguishant that you have within. Some of them are going to be more of a liquid chemical, some of them will be more of a dry powder, and sometimes a mixture of the two. But as you can see, there are multiple types of potential extinguishant that you could have depending on the type of extinguisher. Now, there are Class K fires that are a recognized class of fire by the National Fire Protection Association. Now, unless you have any sort of cafeteria on site where you are actively preparing meals or something like that, you're likely not going to have an instance where you need a Class K extinguisher. And they're generally designed to handle combustible oils, lards, fats that you see in commercial cooking environments. And a lot of times Class K fires can be extinguished with a Class B extinguisher, but unless you have anyone who is actively preparing food on site, you're generally not going to need a Class K fire extinguisher. So, but it's important to note that they are a separate type. And if you happen to see this symbol of basically it's a frying pan with a fire in it, that's a symbol for a Class K fire extinguisher. So when it comes to selecting fire extinguishers and the other types of emergency equipment pertaining to fire-related emergencies, OSHA does state that suitable fire control devices, such as small hoses or portable fire extinguishers, shall be available at locations where flammable liquids are stored. And depending on the type of extinguisher that you have in place, there are maximum travel distances for each fire extinguisher by class. So if you have a Class A extinguisher or a Class D extinguisher on site, they need to be located no more than 75 feet from the hazard they are intended to address. If it's a Class B extinguisher, that maximum travel distance is 50 feet. And if you have Class C extinguishers, they must either follow the Class A or Class B requirement, whichever is more stringent and applicable. OSHA does have a standard that specifically covers portable fire extinguishers. That's 1910.157. This standard covers the placement of fire extinguishers, how, not just where, but how they need to be mounted. There are standards in there pertaining to general use of extinguishers, maintenance and testing of extinguishers. When it comes to inspection, you need to have a reputable entity performing an annual inspection of your extinguisher and providing an annual inspection tag. Your internal personnel will be conducting monthly visual checks on your fire extinguishers, looking through. If you see the photo on the right side of this slide, you kind of see an outline of the anatomy of a fire extinguisher. Anyone performing a monthly visual check will be checking each one of these points to ensure that everything is in place. The data plate is legible. There's no physical defects that are observable. And then on a side note, generally about once every 6 years, and this frequency can vary, extinguishers are required to go through what's called hydrostatic testing. And this is where the extinguishant is completely emptied out. There are pressure tests done on the body of the extinguisher, and it basically just gets a full once over before it's refilled, and then an annual inspection is performed. Some general points, some other general points to consider. You want to make sure that your extinguishers are maintained in a fully charged state. And unless you have CO2 extinguishers, which are only verified to be fully charged by their weight, your extinguisher is going to have a pressure gauge to let you know if it's fully charged, overpressurized, or if it's been accidentally discharged. One point to consider too, in the case of an extinguisher that is overpressurized, if you have extinguishers that are exposed to significant levels of heat, or more commonly, if you have extinguishers that are stored outside and they're just getting hit by the sun on a continuous basis, that amount of heat can cause the internal contents to to expand ever so slightly. That can give the gauge a little bit of a view that it's slightly overpressurized or maybe been overfilled. More often than not, you just need to bring these extinguishers into a shaded area, a cool area, give them a chance to cool off and equalize. And generally, that's all those really need. But last but not least, whatever sort of extinguishers you have in place, make sure that you're only using approved extinguishers. And if there's ever any question on that, check the data plate on the rear of the extinguisher. The data plate on the front will let you know basic directions, the classifications of fire that extinguisher is designed to handle. But then there's another data plate on the back that will have some other information, starting off with the extinguisher serial number. When it comes to mounting your extinguishers around your facility, OSHA does say that these extinguishers must be conspicuously located. However, there's not necessarily a specific definition of what constitutes conspicuous location. So you can be a little creative with it. More often than not, you're going to, as you can see with the picture on the right, you're likely going to see the red and white fire extinguisher stickers that have an arrow. And these are they're commonly used, they're easy to see. And that's just a basic notification to or administrative control to your employees to let them know where these extinguishers are located if they don't have a chance to see an evacuation map right away. You can be a little on the creative side, as you can see with the picture on the left, but however you go about doing this, you just need to ensure that anytime you walk into a room where these extinguishers are located, these things really need to stand out. And so even though there's not an outline definition of conspicuous location, it'll be easy to determine whether or not it would fit the general definition. Now, when it comes to basic extinguisher use, the PASS method is the most commonly accepted form of training this. And PASS is an acronym that stands for pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep. More specifically, pulling the locking pin, aiming low at the base of the fire. If you discharge an extinguisher, aiming for the flames, the extinguishing is just going to pass right through. Once you aim low, then you'll squeeze the handle to discharge the extinguisher, and then you'll want to sweep side to side in order to ensure that extinguishing is covering as much surface area as possible, specifically around the base of the fire. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, you can see the GIF at the bottom. Aiming low, squeezing the trigger, and then sweeping side to side to just ensure that as much of the base of that fire is covered with that extinguisher as possible. But when it comes to extinguisher use, of course, there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things. And it's important to ensure that your employees understand the difference between the two. But before you even get to the decision, or before you even get to a situation where you have to use an extinguisher, we have guidelines for the decision-making criteria for whether or not it is safe and opportune to use an extinguisher. And that is the RACE method. This stands for rescue, alarm, contain, and extinguish. And one note I always like to add, this essentially means in that order as well. So in the case of a fire-related emergency, you want to clear the area, the immediate area, as soon as possible. And that's where rescue comes in. Anybody who could be immediately affected by that fire needs to be cleared from that area first and foremost. Once that area is clear, you want to initiate some sort of alarm or start conveying the emergency to other personnel, so anyone who is not in that direct area can be alerted to the emergency and start either contacting the emergency response coordinator or making a 911 call if that's deemed necessary. The next step would be to contain the fire. Fires are considered in the incipient stage if the fire is shorter than the individual who's holding an extinguisher and the fire has not had a chance to spread. So if there's any way to prevent the fire from spreading at all, those efforts should definitely be taken as well. And if and only if you've taken these steps and you feel that it is safe to use an extinguisher, can you then choose to use one? But fires can be extremely dangerous depending on the fuel source for the fire. So, of course, you want to assist anybody who's in imminent danger, assisting with getting them to safety first and foremost. Then you either call 911 or contact the ERC. And if the fire is small, and only after those first two steps have been taken, should you even attempt to use an extinguisher. But some things to keep in mind. First and foremost, know what is burning. It's common that you'll have an idea of what could be potentially burning depending on the work area. But if even if you have a class ABC extinguisher, it may not necessarily be sufficient for that type of fire. So it's always good to have as much information about the fire as possible. So after that, determining whether or not the fire is spreading. If the fire is already spreading, especially if it's spreading quickly, then the decision to use an extinguisher is pretty much out the door. At that point, the decision should be whether or not to take one designated exit or another. But if you find yourself in a situation where you've taken all the recommended actions that you can and you feel that it would be safe and opportune to use a fire extinguisher, the final rule is always to position yourself with an exit or a means of escape to your back. So if you do decide to use an extinguisher and the extinguisher is either insufficient for the fire in question, or if it malfunctions, in any case, you need to have the opportunity to set that extinguisher down, turn around, and safely exit the building yourself. So to summarize what we've gone through, when it comes to developing your program, your key personnel is selecting your key personnel is always going to be a very vital part of the process. Knowing the foreseeable hazards you have at your facility and the personnel who are going to help safely assess the situation as they come up and evacuate your personnel to your designated assembly areas. This is always going to be the cornerstone of any emergency action plan. But knowing and having procedures that are standardized and familiar to your employees on how to handle a medical emergency, how to handle a chemical spill, how to react to the various types of fire-related emergencies, and ensuring that drills of this plan and the different types of foreseeable emergencies are being carried out on a periodic basis. Generally, you need to be conducting a drill of your emergency action plan at least annually. And I would say if you have multiple types of foreseeable emergencies at your facility, you want to practice each type of drill at least once every year. You definitely want to ensure that any new personnel, so any new hires need to be at least briefed on the emergency action plan prior to their first work task, just so that they have some level of familiarity on their first day of work. And then after that, you want to include your annual drills. And once you've had a chance to perform a drill and discuss the results with all those involved, you'll use that information as part of the next round of employee training. So having said all of that, I know that was a lot of information to take in, but I think now we'll see if we have any other questions. There was one I wanted to circle back to. I think it was on the active shooters. So in the case of emergency reporting, in the case of an active shooter, with most of us having smartphones available to us, that definitely gives anybody the option to dial 911 the moment they have any sort of information or informing them that there is an active shooter on site or an active workplace violence emergency. Sometimes it can be a little counterproductive, as this question is implying. If you're trying to give out a full alert, like a company-wide alert in the case of a workplace violence emergency, it could escalate the situation, obviously, but you still want to have you still need to have some sort of procedure in place of alerting any sort, at the very least, your emergency response coordinator and any sort of emergency services who may be applicable to that scenario. So having the ability to contact police in addition to your emergency response coordinator, those two procedures would definitely need to be in place and established. That would be my recommendation of where to start when it comes to how to alert your employees in emergencies of that type. Looking at the list just to see if there's any other questions. I think that's all I've got on my list for right now. Liz, did you have anything?
No, I think that's it. Thanks so much, JP. We appreciate that. Now I'm going to transfer you back to an attendee, and we have next Tommy Berry with Berg Compliance Solutions for our next speaker. So thanks, JP. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to submit them again when we do questions at the end. So.
Not a problem. Thank you very much.